Hello, welcome back to Module 11 of Deploying Office 365 in the Accelerated Jumpstart. We're switching gears right now with having Fulvio back.
Hi.
For the last final modules on talk about now, first of all, in Module 11, planning SharePoint Online, and the next module, we continue on SharePoint Online. I'll hand it over to Fulvio and put a little bit of context around where this session fits in and what we're going to talk about in the next 50 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stefan. Okay, today we will continue with our SharePoint journey in Office 365. On the first day, we'll talk about the general information and feature provided by SharePoint Online. So, what is included, what is not included, compared to an on-premise version, plans, and so on. Today, we will continue our overview about SharePoint Online with the planning module. So, we will understand what is really important for an administrator to consider before moving to the cloud. So, what is better to watch out, what is better to control before moving data, users, but also application to SharePoint Online. This module will be a theoretical module, so we will not have any real demo during this module, but this is really important because we can learn together how to handle particular situation, how to move data, and so on. The next one, instead, the next module that has been called Using and Deploying SharePoint Online, will be only demo based, more or less. We will have just a few slides. We will see together in the next module instead the administration of SharePoint Online. So we will cover how to create a site collection, how to create site, how to manage user and site collection from the administrator perspective, and then we will cover also how to manage a website inside the SharePoint. So we will talk about metadata, we will talk about my site, audit, and so on. So planning now, and then the real job on SharePoint. Let's continue with this particular module. So planning. What we will cover during this particular session. We will have a really quick recap of all the SharePoint deployment phases. So what is important to consider before starting to deploying a SharePoint Online project. We will talk about the activities that are important in the planning phase. So what is important to consider. We will talk a bit about a possible planning framework about the migration. Some topics that we will cover are, for example, URL, desktop, authentication, storage, how to organize the information inside a SharePoint infrastructure. We will talk a bit about the public-facing site and external sharing that we will see later in the demo, and instead about the public-facing site we already covered during the first day. Then we will talk a bit about the customization and deployment of SharePoint Online. The customization part is not so much important for the exam, so you don't need to be a real developer to attend the exam about Office 365, just to have the big picture of the capabilities that are provided by all the tools that can work with SharePoint Online. Then we will talk also about some possible scenario about workload. So when it's better to go for the cloud opportunity, and when it's better to decide for the on-premise environment. And then we will cover just a few information about the hybrid or coexistence between an on-premise SharePoint and a SharePoint Online. So how both the environment can work together to manage user access and also information. So let's start with the first topic of this session, that is about the deployment phase in SharePoint Online. What we should do before starting to moving our infrastructure to SharePoint Online. First, as we said also the first and the second day, we should run the deployment readiness tool to understand more about our infrastructure. So, for example, the number of users inside our infrastructure. This could be a potential problem in a migration from the local environment to SharePoint Online. We need to run the desktop setup on the client to be ready to to access without any possible problem to Office 365, but also to SharePoint Online. We will discuss this particular topic in a while, and we will discover why the desktop setup can help in working with the Internet Explorer and SharePoint Online. We need to plan for user or identity. Yesterday we talked a lot about cloud identities, federated identities, and so on. So we need to find the best solution to manage the identities in SharePoint Online. What is really important when we need to plan a possible migration from a local architecture to SharePoint Online is to review the requirement of the customer and map the features, because not the features that are provided by a local SharePoint will be available in SharePoint Online. Here the service description about SharePoint Online is a must, is the resource that you need to check before starting every project, just to check if during a time frame of few weeks something changed, because as we said many times, cloud services or solution will be updated many times during a short time frame. It's not like an on-premise solution. Maybe something today is not available, and maybe in 1 week there is that feature that we were asking for. This is really important. So service description is a must. Let's continue with determining workload for cloud and on-premises. So also in this case, when it's better to use SharePoint on-premise and when to use SharePoint Online for handle a particular kind of data or for a particular audience also too. Then we need to evaluate also tools and vendors for data migration, because we will need maybe to propose a solution to our customer to migrate our data from a local SharePoint, for example, and SharePoint Online. So we will talk about that later during the storage and data planning. What else? We can also evaluate with the customer a pilot group that we will start working with SharePoint Online, and we'll start evaluating the platform, because maybe they are used to work with SharePoint 2010 and the SharePoint Online needs to be customized to satisfy all the customer needs. This is really important too. So let's continue after the plan phase with the framework. So again, this is really important. Read and triple check, not double check, the SharePoint Online for Enterprise Service Description many times during your project. Then read also the SharePoint Online Planning Guide. This will help you a lot in understanding how to manage your content in a possible SharePoint Online environment. So we will have a look to this particular guide later to understand how could help you in understanding how to manage data and the users. Then start planning for people and group permission, because we learned yesterday that we can create a security group in our infrastructure. We can create a user or import user for our Active Directory, but not all these users should have access to a particular site collection in SharePoint, a particular document library maybe, or a particular single item. So we will need to plan also the security and the groups that will have access to a particular area of the site. We can eventually consider with the customer specific onboarding stage. So start onboarding to SharePoint Online a few users before, and then the whole infrastructure, the whole company later. What else? This is really important, site content and structure. We need to plan and to start thinking about if it's better to have just a single site collection, speaking in SharePoint term, or have multiple site collection or sub-site to handle the content inside our SharePoint infrastructure. So sub-site, site collection, security group, how to access and manage data inside SharePoint. We need also to start thinking about how to customize the layout of our SharePoint Online. In this case, site template. We need to create and import data inside document libraries. We need to customize the navigation and so on. Which tool should I use to customize the layout of SharePoint Online? So for example, SharePoint Designer. We need also to evaluate a possible, especially in big enterprises, a possible content management strategy to handle the expiration policy of the content, the assessment of the content, and also the auditing of the content and how it's managed inside my site collection. We need for SharePoint Online also to define like the SharePoint on-premises, to define a primary administrator. This administrator will be the administrator that will administer the SharePoint Online infrastructure, but we need to choose also lower administrator that will only take care of a particular site collection maybe. So I can also delegate the administration of a particular site collection to other users inside my company. So user planning is another important component inside the planning of SharePoint Online. What else? We need to also evaluate all the solutions that we need to implement for the customization. So we need to evaluate SharePoint Designer, we need to plan for solution, we need to plan for customization, what I can do and what I can't do in SharePoint Online. So here, for example, there is a good guide that it is called the SharePoint Online Developers Guide that is a really good resource to understand all the possibilities and limits offered by SharePoint Online on the customization side. So let's start with the first one, so plan identity. We discussed yesterday in particular in the morning and in the first part of the afternoon about identities. So if we want to use for our SharePoint Online infrastructure just cloud identities, so no integration at all with our Active Directory, our infrastructure, or better, we can choose to have an integration with DirSync or also a federation with our Active Directory. This could be good, especially in really big environments or when our end user we will need to access to SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint Online with the same credentials, so same username and same password. We need also to plan for external sharing. We discovered, and we will see a demo later, that with SharePoint Online we can share our website access with external users, for example, with partners, with customers, vendors, is not a problem. But to enable this feature, we need to plan also for these kind of accounts, so Live ID, which account are supported, which system can I use? Can I use online ID or just Live ID? Are just an example, but it's something that should be planned when proposing a SharePoint Online solution to our customers. Authentication choices. I will not spend so much time here, just to underline you that the first row here is about cloud identity, so no integration at all with our on-premises infrastructure. The second one instead is cloud identity, but with the user synchronized with the local Active Directory using DirSync, and the third one is ADFS and single sign-on between your on-premise environment and Office 365, and in particular SharePoint Online. You need to choose carefully the right approach and the right authorization system. This is really important, as we said. This slide is important too because will give us an example about how the different identities will handle the access to our SharePoint Online infrastructure. So, for example, if I'm a user and I'm accessing to SharePoint Online using just a cloud identity, so no integration, as we said, my user will need to sign in to the SharePoint Online in each browser session. So every time insert at least the password, if not username and password at the same time, using the Office 365 portal, the web access of SharePoint and so on, but also using Office 2010 and 2007. If I'm using instead federated identities and I'm joined in a domain, so I'm inside my corporate network, If I try to access to the Office 365 portal, to SharePoint Online, OWA, and so on, my password and my username will not be asked for any reason. So I'm inside the corporate network, and I have a single sign-on enabled inside my organization. What else? If I'm using instead Office 2010 or 2007 and SharePoint Online, I need to sign in with SharePoint Online in each session. If not, I can also tick the remember my credential to enter and log out from the system without reinserting my credential. If I have the federated identities and I'm federated, so there is single sign-on in place, but I'm outside of the company, so maybe I'm working from home, I'm working in a vendor remote site, for example, I need to sign in each browser session to enter to SharePoint Online, Office 365, and also for the Office application is the same, so I need to sign in every time. Why the Office 365 Desktop Setup Assistant is so important for SharePoint Online? On the first day and yesterday we talked a bit about the Desktop Setup Assistant. It prepares the client to access to Office 365. It's important because it also marks the SharePoint Online sites and the Office 365 sites as trusted sites. So you will not receive any kind of error, any kind of message about the fact that a specific site could be not trusted. So we'll help more the administrator to configure the end user desktop. Administration. If you are a SharePoint 2010 administrator, you will know that there are many areas of the SharePoint infrastructure that needs to be administrated. So for example, we need to plan for the database, we need to plan for the security, services, trust, integration, load balancing, high availability, and so on. Instead, if you are a SharePoint Online administrator, you will just need to define and configure the environment. You will not perform any kind of operation related to high availability, security, logging, planning, database management, and so on. This is really, really important because you don't need to be an expert of local SharePoint infrastructure to manage also SharePoint Online. It's a bit easier. SharePoint Online needs plenty of feature, functionalities, and options, but it's less complex than traditional SharePoint infrastructure. What should do or perform a SharePoint Online administrator inside his organization? He should manage site collection, so the first container for all the SharePoint sites and websites and also sub-sites inside a subscription. You need to define the storage, the resource allocation, the collection owner. You need to enable or disable the external sharing. You need to plan for the language. You need to manage also Infopath, user profiles, business data connectivity, term store, and secure store service. I will not spend so much time here about this particular topic because we will cover that in the next section when we will see in action the administration center in SharePoint Online. So we will spend many minutes later on these particular topics. Plan for user account and profile sync. We learned yesterday when we talked about DirSync and synchronization from the on-premise system to SharePoint Online, we learned that DirSync occurs every 3 hours and optionally synchronize the users that are inside your forest with Office 365. You can use these users also with SharePoint Online, not only for Exchange or to access the portal. It's normal. But what is important for us is that you need to plan the required time to import the profile update in the SharePoint Online profile database. So you will create a new user, for example, on the Office 365 portal, but then this user will receive later a profile in SharePoint Online, and eventually an end user could also evaluate to update his information on the SharePoint Online portal, my site, and so on. So could be interesting also here to start importing the profile, then the users, and then the profile, and enable end users, if we want, to customize their information, to update their information, their photo, for example, and maybe we will learn later. We could also add additional information to the user profile. So this is also an important activity that should be planned. We need also, as an administrator, to assign to our end user the license or access to SharePoint Online. So directory sync before, cloud identity before, it's okay, but we need also to add a license to that user. So planning licensing for end users is also really, really important. So if they need to have SharePoint Online, maybe plan 1, plan 2, based on their needs. So if they need to use, for example, Visio services, access services, or advanced feature provided by SharePoint Online Plan 2, we will need to assign the correct license to that user. So planning before moving a specific user to SharePoint is a must. Oh, there is one last important information. When an administrator creates a new site collection inside the SharePoint Online, he will be the only person that will be able to access to that particular site collection. The administrator will need to enable one user, a group of users, or all the users inside the Office 365 tenant to access to a specific site collection. If not, the end user will receive a message telling him that he is not authorized to access to a specific site collection. This is important too. Sorry. When we talk about SharePoint Online, we need to consider that there will be 3 different or more URL for the SharePoint Online service. The first one will be something like organizationdomain.sharepoint.com. The organization domain is the temporary domain, or better, the domain that you defined when you created the subscription inside SharePoint Online, in the real beginning of the subscription, or when you created the trial. So it will be your custom domain.sharepoint.com. And then we will have another URL like your custom domain.my.sharepoint.com that will be used for my site in the SharePoint Online infrastructure. Then we will have another one that will be used for administrative purposes, for the central admin, that will be your custom domain -admin.sharepoint.com. So at last, 3 different domains for your SharePoint infrastructure. Plan to open the required ports and eventually URL filtering on your firewall for that. It's really important. If not, your users will not be able to access to the SharePoint Online infrastructure. You will need also eventually to plan for a custom domain, a real domain for your public-facing website. So if you are planning to use the site that we discovered together on the first day and that we will re-see just for a few seconds later, you need to plan also to buy a potential domain with GoDaddy, or reuse a domain that you already own for the SharePoint public-facing website. That site will be with anonymous access, so no authentication at all and no HTTPS. This is a real important topic about SharePoint Online, storage and site collection. First question that you should ask to your customer is about the storage requirement for all the time, for all the team site collection and all the data that they are planning to move to the cloud. So you need to have with you your service description, so all the information about limits in SharePoint Online, and work with the customer to understand the storage requirements and limits that are related to SharePoint Online, for example. You need also to start to plan about a possible yearly growth of the content. So today the content is, for example, 100 gigabyte. In 3 years, how much will be this content is important, because if not, we risk to have problem in a possible near future because of the limitation of SharePoint Online. So planning is a must for SharePoint Online, but not only, also other services.
Now, let me stop you here before we go into user and sites. What about migrating from other sources?
Fantastic.
Like, for instance, from sources like file shares?
Fantastic. Okay, this is a really important topic related to SharePoint Online, not only related to file share, that is a typical example, but also migrating data from on-premise SharePoint, because maybe I have some data inside already, SharePoint inside my local infrastructure, and I want to move a document library, I want to move list, custom web parts, so on, to SharePoint Online. This is a common question. And we have also an official answer for that. At the moment, Microsoft does not provide an official internal tool to move data from a local infrastructure to SharePoint Online, preserving maybe metadata, preserving version, preserving, for example, user access, and so on. We don't have an official tool at the moment. We just can provide an easy way to upload files to SharePoint Online. That is the classical Explorer view inside the SharePoint Online. Maybe if we will have time, we will have a look at it later during the next session. But we strongly suggest, as Microsoft, to use third-party partners to migrate your data from a local SharePoint, for example, to SharePoint Online. These partners are usually Quest or Metalogix. They already built two good products to migrate not only the single element or the single file, but also a more complex structure that maybe was already in place inside the SharePoint 2010, for example, or also 2007, or also services and so on. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So what is important to know is that Exchange Online provides many tools and options to migrate your data to Exchange Online. For SharePoint Online, we strongly suggest to use partner solution, because our partners are important, as we said. Let's continue with the presentation, the deck. Okay, when I'm planning to move to SharePoint Online, I should also evaluate the possibility that I need to buy additional storage, because as we learned on the first day, SharePoint Online provides 10 gigabyte of storage on the first stage, on the first setup, plus 500 megabyte for each user. If we need more space, we can buy additional space directly from the Office 365 portal. So be careful to plan the right amount of space. If not, you will risk to buy more space than what is needed and pay more for nothing. Make sense? Okay. We need also to evaluate the number of site collection that we want to create inside our SharePoint Online site collection, because there is also a limit here, and we need to check the customer environment if this limit will fit with his needing, for example. What else? It's also a good strategy to suggest directly the migration solution to your customer. So don't just sell the product to the customer, but keep helping him in moving his data infrastructure, but also customization, that is the most important part, to SharePoint Online. We need to plan, when we are talking about SharePoint Online, sites and users, as we said. So storage and resources, how to isolate data from one site and the other. So we are speaking about physical division of site collection, for example, but also security and security group, permission, and so on. We need to plan what type of content we want to move from the on-premise system to the cloud or online system. So just Office documents, or also movies, for example, movies, drawings, and so on. Because an Office document can be a few megabytes larger, but a video could be even larger. So maybe big video files are not the best kind of data that could be stored inside a SharePoint Online site in general. We need to also maybe start thinking about the hierarchy of the team. So the main site, the sub-site, pages, a possible additional sub-site, and so on. So this is really important and should be performed before moving users and data to our SharePoint Online infrastructure. We need to define, as we said, site collection and site owner, so the user that will be able to perform additional operation and configuration operation inside our site collection and infrastructure. We will see that in the next module, when we will talk about security and user management in SharePoint Online. It's also important to evaluate and plan for languages and my site. So which languages will be provided by SharePoint Online, and if we want or need to provide additional languages to our SharePoint Online infrastructure, and if we want to enable and customize my site for end users, for example. If we want that my site will be a fixed site, or a site that can be updated and managed by end user. If we want that my site will reside on SharePoint Online or the local SharePoint. It's all about planning. Some tips and tricks about sites and user management. The first one, if possible, use the Active Directory groups to SharePoint Online groups. So we are speaking about DirSync and then using synced groups with SharePoint Online. Second suggestion is to create a group with an interesting, or better, a clever name. So, for example, site name, subsite, list name, permission level. So it could be easier to find and understand what a particular permission security group is providing, and if I need to, for example, add an additional user, I can find that security group in an easier way, in a faster way. What else? Keep permissions level simple if possible. So try to use, where possible, built-in SharePoint Online user permissions. So visitor, site owner, site contributor, and so on. So usually read, contribute, and administer are the most common, let me say, permissions that should be assigned to a specific user. Here again, another suggestion is to not assign a specific permission level or permission access to a specific element inside a list, inside a SharePoint document library, and so on. This will be complex to be managed later and could increase the complexity of your infrastructure. Plan information architecture, how the data will be stored and managed inside SharePoint Online. If I want to have a site collection and then different subsites, or if I want to have a site collection and team sites inside my SharePoint Online infrastructure. It's better to create a single site collection with multiple subsites, or multiple site collection that maybe are created based on business unit inside the organization. So I will suggest you later a good reading about generally how to manage SharePoint online sites, site collection and subsites. So the best strategy to plan between also sites and teams, site collection and so on. This will help you a lot, especially if you will not have any, let me say that, any so much deeper competency on SharePoint Online. Then, security requirement. If you are building a site collection with many subsites, for example, the best approach and the easiest approach will be to have something like security inheritance from all the subsite to keep the same level of access and security from the top parent site to the other subsite. And we need to plan also with the customer if they will need to have specific navigation, if the customer has specific search requirements, so scoping and so on, and if eventually he needs to create a specific template for his organization. There is a lot of work for partners in templates and customization of SharePoint Online. Moving the data is just the first step. The second one will be to customize and edit the SharePoint Online to fit the customer needs. Is the core of every SharePoint infrastructure, not only the on-premise but also the online version. Some suggestion about how to organize the information inside the SharePoint infrastructure. We have different ways to organize a subsite. We can organize a subsite based on department, by functional purpose, based by content category, by project, by customer, by permission level, are just some examples, and this will help you in keeping data separated and also to have a better overview and management of your site collection and subsite inside your Office 365 and the SharePoint Online environment. It's a good idea also to start to monitor and maintain site collection and site, so to start understanding the space allocation of a specific site collection or sites. We will see later in the demo how it's possible inside a SharePoint site collection to understand how much space has been used, how much space has been allocated to a specific site collection, and how to, let me say, understand which items or elements are using too much space in my SharePoint Online. I will need also to eventually move data from a site collection to another site collection. Maybe one site collection will be used to archive all the items, another one will be used for the current information. It's just an example. A suggestion here for performance reason is about lists and libraries. When you create a list or a library in SharePoint Online, it's suggested to keep a maximum of 5,000 items per folder view. So it's not the maximum amount of items inside the folder, but it's the maximum amount of items that I should view inside a page with SharePoint Online. So it's just for performance reason. We need also to plan for external sharing, because we will see in a few minutes how it's possible with SharePoint Online to share a specific site or subsite with external users that are not part of our organization. But we need also to plan how and who can invite these external users to our SharePoint Online subscription, for example. What else? We need also to work with end user to plan a communication plan for external users, and we will also need to train end user about how to use in the most efficient way possible external sharing. If not, we will cap really soon the maximum number of external users inside our company. Customization deployment. As we said, it's not so much important for the exam to be a developer, to attend and test the exam about Office 365. What is important to know is what we can use to customize our SharePoint Online infrastructure. We have here three possibilities. The first on your left, on the left column, is about configuration out of the box. So using just the web interface, I can customize, add, edit, modify web part, workflow, site template, list, library, all using a regular browser, not only Internet Explorer, as we said. You can use it also on Chrome, on Firefox, on Safari, and so on. If we need to do something more and change the layout of the site, it's strongly suggested to use SharePoint Designer. Keep it easy. With SharePoint Designer, it's a free tool from Microsoft that you can download from the download.microsoft.com, and you can, for example, change the layout of your SharePoint site. You can also edit many areas of your SharePoint site. You can create workflow, easy workflow with not code to be created and generated. You can change and update master page. You can also create a site template using SharePoint Designer. This is a good solution, especially if you are not a developer, to create a custom solution. Development. If you are instead a developer, you can still use Visual Studio 2010 to work with SharePoint Online and develop a custom solution. But keep in mind that you will need to use Silverlight, Client Object Model, Web Services, and all the solutions that you will create in Visual Studio 2010 will run in a secure environment in a sandboxed environment. So we'll avoid the potential problem related to security and potential problem related to a bugged code on SharePoint Online. You need also to plan for user profile properties. We had a fast overview before about directory synchronization, and that SharePoint Online manage also an internal user profile system. You need also to plan with the customer if the current profile system Fullify is needing. So if not, you will need to, for example, add additional properties to the user profile page, to the My Profile page. You need to evaluate which attributes should be added to the user profile, and so on. It's really important also to, let me say that, to evaluate with the customer if some properties related to a profile should be visible to everyone for privacy reason. So, for example, the cell phone number, just an example, or if other area inside the profile should be modified directly by the end user. So, for example, if I can, as an end user, to change my birth date or change the phone number, the marital status, and so on. It's just an example, but need to be planned. You need to plan also for My Sites. So on the first day we discovered that SharePoint Online offers also My Sites for personal data storage and also to maintain the personal profile. So you can access to your My Site, you can update your profile, you can store there your particular data, and you will be have also 500 megabytes of space that you can use as you want without impacting the total amount of space that is offered by the SharePoint Online. You can also have the opportunity to link your My Site to a possible My Site on-premise. So if an online user will try to access to his My Site will be redirected to the on-premises My Site. Plan for Infopath, form, and term set. Here again, we will need to evaluate with the customer if he will need Infopath, so form services, and if he want to render his content using the browser or the Infopath client. We will see that in a while during the next session. We will work also with the customer to evaluate possible term set and metadata choices. So if we want to import a term set from the on-premise environment, this is possible. If we want to create an enterprise taxonomy, an enterprise metadata store for cloud or shared with the on-premise system and so on. Additional work here. We need to plan for BDC, business data connectivity, or also business connectivity services, so the ability for SharePoint Online to connect to an external database system or data management system and show this data directly inside SharePoint Online. We will see that during the demo in the next session. We will need to plan for that, but also we will need to define with the customer if and how SharePoint Online will access to external resources. So business connectivity service is just an example. We can work also using Window Communication Foundation to let me say interact with other external application or data sources. You need also to plan eventually, if you are using the business connectivity services, for the secure store service. The secure store service will allow SharePoint Online user to connect and retrieve data and information from external applications seamlessly without requiring an additional login prompt. So access to external data directly from SharePoint Online in a sort of single sign-on. Plan for cloud workload. What to store in SharePoint Online and what not to store in SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online is a good solution, a good opportunity to store, for example, sites, communities, contents, and so on. So project and team collaboration, social community, training center, knowledge center, intranet portal, external sharing that we will see later. It's the best solution. Instead, if you prefer to work with search in a better way, maybe you will need a fast feature, for example, in sites or composites, it would be better to use the SharePoint on-premise version, because actually, as we said, and as is written inside the service description, actually SharePoint Online is limited for search in site and composites. Let's continue with the large-scale enterprise customer. We can choose to have an on-premise environment and a cloud services, but also we can have an hybrid environment here with SharePoint Online and SharePoint on premises, for example. So the good thing is that with SharePoint Online we will have also a license for a local SharePoint on-premise infrastructure. So just one license to access to the online SharePoint, but also to the local SharePoint. What you will need just also is the server license of the local SharePoint, but the user license will be just one. Hybrid. This is really interesting too, because we can provide seamless access to the local infrastructure and also to the SharePoint infrastructure using the same credentials, for example.
And that's where we see the ADFS coming in, right? Going back to yesterday when we talked about ADFS and DirSync and all these elements. ADFS, that's where ADFS is relevant for SharePoint.
It's perfect. It's nothing different than what we learned yesterday about ADFS, single sign-on, and user management and identities. We will use the same system, so ADFS, single sign-on, Federation Server Farm, proxy, DirSync, to enable a user that is located locally on the on-premise system to access also to SharePoint Online. So I can click on a link on my SharePoint or my local SharePoint, and then click on another link and be redirected maybe on the SharePoint Online without reinserting credential. So single sign-on between your local and your online or cloud system. Same infrastructure, okay? No additional server to be inserted inside your architecture.
Perfect. There's always a notion that it's only associated with messaging, mail, Exchange Online, basically connect to my Exchange server, but it's the same system and infrastructure that enables federation here between SharePoint server on premises and SharePoint Online. So
just to be more clear again, ADFS, you can use it to provide single sign-on in general, so same user, same password in general. You can provide, it's a requirement for hybrid environment that we discussed before with Aginkia, and you can, it's not a must here, implement it to enable user to access to a local SharePoint and a SharePoint Online. It's a possibility, okay, not a must in this case. So, as we said, common workload for a local SharePoint and on-premise SharePoint are insight, content, composite, fast search, internet sites, and a common workload for SharePoint Online, sites, content, community, SharePoint search, and basic forms. Hybrid consideration, it's a good idea to understand with the customer when to use an hybrid environment. So, plan eventually for single sign-on, so the session that we delivered yesterday about federated identity. Plan with the customer if SharePoint Online will need to access to external data sources using business connectivity services. Plan for taxonomy, search, my site, profile, and so on. And eventually, with SharePoint Online, you need to work with your customer to evaluate a possible public-facing website.
Oh, and here we have the public-facing website coming back. So the public-facing website is the one piece where you can have a website for a small business, small company, your personal website, but it's fairly limited in what you can do with it, right? Editing only, not with SharePoint Designer, not with Visual Studio, only with the tools that are provided on the website itself.
Great, fantastic. Keep in mind that the public-facing website is just for facing activities between your company and the internet. It's not to be meant for example, for an e-commerce site. It's not the target of the public-facing website. Just the information about your company. So about us, where we are, our catalog, for example, and so on. Easy editing. Okay, makes sense. These sites will be anonymous, no authentication at all, and you can eventually define your own domain. Make sense?
Yeah.
Perfect. Few information that are really important for you. In particular, I suggest you to have a look to the first link, that is the SharePoint Online Planning Guide for Office 365 for Enterprises, that will give you some advice and some information about planning sites, planning sub-site, when is better to use a site collection, when is better to use a sub-site, a site, and so on. This is a good resource, as I said, if you're not maybe an administrator of SharePoint in general and you want to know more about the best choice to be done.
Yes.
That's all.
Thank you so much, Fulvio, for this first part of our two-part final SharePoint Online planning. And next session will be next module, last module of the entire 3-day course on SharePoint Online, more on the implementation piece.
Yeah, demo.
Demo.
It's a promise.
Yep. One demo after the other. So thank you so much. We'll be back after the break in 10 minutes. And with that,
see you in a while.